Hi, everybody. My name is Eddie White, and this is our part of our regular series of assessment literacy webinars. And we are talking about assessing writing today for August. So I'm going to get into screen share mode here and show everybody my simple PowerPoint that I've put together to just guide our discussion. So we begin with, I have some, this monthly webinar was a little bit different. We have some sponsors that English 3 is sponsoring us, and also International Test of English Proficiency, ITEP. So thanks to both of those for sponsoring what we're doing. And basically what we're doing is just we're promoting assessment literacy and best practices in assessment, and exchanging ideas and answering questions about different aspects of assessment. So today we're going to talk about assessing writing, but just a reminder about, because I was looking at the list of webinars that I'm doing, and I'm mentioning the productive skills, right? And I mentioned about assessing speaking and assessing writing, which is also the productive skills. So just a reminder about I guess one way of considering those. So we talk about the receptive skills of reading and listening, right? When students are receiving language. So students are receiving language. What is the primary thing we're looking for assessment-wise in terms of assessing the receptive skills? What do you think? What is the one particular thing that you want to be focused on assessment-wise with reading and listening?
Comprehension.
Yeah. Comprehension is the key thing, right? And particularly, so I mean, we're trying to figure out if students are understanding the things that they're reading or what they're hearing. Now, if we go to the productive skills of speaking and writing, similar students, so students are producing language, and the focus is on their language production. But particularly, what are two particular things that we're considering in terms of the language that they're producing, particularly related to assessment? What are two things we want to focus on assessment-wise? Any ideas?
Well, it has to be comprehensive. Even language production, you can produce a language and
yes, right. I mean, they have to be able to understand what they're saying. So you get into things like pronunciation and diction and things like that. But particularly what I'm after is just the 2 points about fluency and accuracy. And I find that just a simple way of reminding myself of what I'm after. Now, there's various components to those, but especially in speaking, for example, fluency is primarily related to the rate of speech, just how quickly people are producing the language. But you can also see fluency in writing when you're assessing writing, and you know what it's like when you see there's a smoothness to the writing, and there's different types of sentences and stuff, and rather than that choppy, short stuff. And of course, accuracy. I mean, I think accuracy is almost one of the definitions of proficiency in the language. Very proficient users of the language make few or no mistakes, right? And the more mistakes you get, the lower the level of proficiency. So, and it's the same with writing or with speaking, I think. So just a reminder, I think, about those things, about the productive and receptive skills. So today, in today's webinar, we're talking about assessing writing. And I think I lifted this graphic actually from there's a journal that's actually called this about assessing writing. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. I showed you, I think I sent you a short article, which no doubt you've read 3 or 4 times now, and you know some of the things that are in there, by Sarah Wagle, and she certainly has some expertise in assessing writing. And when we had a CALT conference, Classroom Assessment Conference, our first one in 2016, and she came and was our keynote speaker. So she was great. It was glad to have her participate. Okay, when I do webinars, sometimes I get into quiz mode, and of course I'm both checking and promoting assessment literacy at the same time. Okay, all right. So I have 3 questions for you. And by the way, if you have that article nearby, you're not even having a sideways glance at it, Gabriel. I see you getting ready to open it there. Okay, so here are the questions. What are the 2 key elements of any writing assessment? What does she say about the 2 key elements of any writing assessment? Gabriel, go ahead, but you're muted.
I was just thinking out loud.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry. Anybody?
Are you referring to, I actually made a note of this. Are you referring to bringing composition, that we sort of see writing assessment from two directions, that we're bringing composition skills in from one direction, we're bringing language skills in from the other direction. Is that what you're referring to?
No, and I remember that part. That's not what I'm referring to, but she specifies that there's two key elements that we should be looking at when we're talking about writing assessment.
Do we mean
content?
Sorry.
Content? No, that's not what we mean, although that's going to be part of it. Holly?
Do we mean the task? What is the task they're doing? We're asking them to do?
Yeah, and says, what is it? What is the task? What is it that we're asking students to do, right? You're asking them to write a paragraph or an essay, or maybe there's a series of tasks. You put together a writing test and you want to have a series of tasks. And the other key thing is the scoring. How is the writing being scored? And I remembered reading this, and here's what I also think. I think those are two key elements in almost any kind of summative assessment, or in almost any kind of test also. If you've got a TOEFL test or an ITIP test or whatever, what you have a series of tasks, and then how are they scored? How is each component scored? It's the same way, it's the same way if I'm making a test for the classroom. There's a task involved and there's some kind of scoring. So I find that just a simple way of remembering those two key elements of almost kind of any assessment. And if they're both good, then kind of it gives you the indication that maybe it's a good test. You've got good tasks in place, you've got an effective scoring system in place, and maybe you have a good assessment. If you've got problems with either one of them, maybe you've got a great rubric there for the scoring, but some of the tasks that you're asking students to do, what is it that you're asking them to do, can be a problem. Just let me give you an example that comes to mind with a task. And I remember a task, seeing it on a writing test I was reviewing, and it asked students, it was a paragraph writing task. Students had to write a paragraph, right? And the task was, you're writing an email to your friend about your recent vacation, right? Write a paragraph with a topic, sentence, and support, and a conclusion. Now, when was the last time anybody constructed an email that that was like that? So there's a problem or a flaw with the task. So I'm highlighting this just because I think these are a simple, useful way of remember. Most kinds of assessments are connected with a task and a scoring. Speaking of scoring, just a reminder of just a couple of things about rubrics. And we have a seminar coming up next month about rubrics, but just let me show you a couple of quick examples of two rubrics that we have. There's a holistic rubric here. Okay. By the way, if anybody wants a copy of this slideshow, just send me an email later, and I can send it to you. So you don't have to worry too much about taking notes if you're doing that. Here's an example of a holistic rubric, right? And with a holistic rubric, students are just given one particular score. In this case, it's out of 100. And so, for example, I'm giving them a B or an 85 for their essay. This is an essay writing rubric. Here's another rubric. This is an analytic rubric. And you see that students are given individual scores according to different criteria. And of course, these are all added together. This rubric, by the way, it's a ESL composition profile, and I think it's great. It's been around for a while. It's been around since like the late 80s, and it's used a lot in English language essay writing classes at American universities. And I like it for a couple of reasons. I really like those criteria there. You see on the left side, you have content, organization, vocabulary, language use, and mechanics. And when I discovered this, I made versions of this rubrics for a paragraph writing class, for an essay writing class, and I've been using a version of this for years. So I think it's really good. One thing to just ask you about, look at the scoring system that's in place. Well, what do you, if you see level here, and you look under level for the different categories, what do you notice about the scoring system in place?
It's weighted.
In what sense is it weighted?
So some categories have more value than others.
Yes, absolutely, great. Yeah, and that's a concise way of putting it, Michael. Also, and you see the content categories were 30, right? And then all the way from vocabulary. Language use is out of a maximum of 25 points. And then you get mechanics down at the bottom here, right? Punctuation and spelling and things like that. And it's just a reminder, because sometimes you'll see a rubric and all of the categories are of equal weight. And you look at it and almost immediately the bells start ringing that that's a problem. Because clearly some things are more important in something like an essay. And some would argue, and I think it's true, that probably, I mean, the most important thing is the content and the ideas that are there. So it's a good reminder though of sometimes giving different value to different things with a rubric. Okay, moving ahead, now we have 3 questions. So question number 2, back to the Weigel article, the qualities of good tests. So she has 3 main qualities of good tests. Anybody want to take a shot at those?
The students are supposed to be able to understand the questions. Sometimes the questions are written in a way that are confusing for students, or
yes, that is true. Yes, it is true. But we're thinking about the quality of the test itself, and 3 some fundamental assessment things that are important for a good test.
Validity.
Sorry?
Validity.
Yep, keep going, Tani.
Reliability.
Uh-huh. And the last one is, what's the last one, Tani?
Practicality.
Whether it's practical or not. So, and reliability, of course, is all about the consistency of measurement. The validity is whether we're measuring what we intend to measure, and of course that last one is just how practical it is to produce the test and also to score it, okay? So just a reminder about 3 of those main qualities. And sometimes you think, I mean, they're obvious, but so for example, for you see sometimes like in a writing test, well, validity is easy. I'm assessing their writing ability. What's the issue here with validity? But sometimes you'll get things, you'll see a rubric and it has a critical thinking component. It's a critical thinking. Now that's different from writing proficiency. And if you're assessing students' critical thinking ability, then you've got issues with the validity now of your writing test. Okay. Weigel talks a little bit about timed writing tests, and sometimes we use those for classroom assessment. Large-scale language tests, of course, use timed writing tests. What's a problem with timed writing tests, and one reason why some people don't like them or complain about them?
Some people just don't function well under time.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that, Perry. Could you go ahead a bit louder?
The test taker may have the knowledge, but they don't function well under timed tests. They may have the knowledge.
Yeah, that's an issue in the issue of test anxiety. But I don't know. I mean, I think that's overplayed sometimes. And maybe that comes from personal experience, because I remember testing situations where I had a lot of test anxiety, and the reason was I wasn't prepared. I didn't study, or I didn't do whatever. That was, so it wasn't skill or content. And sometimes students will say this sometimes. But something else. What is it? There's something else about timed writing tests. Ollie, you had an idea?
How often are we asked to do that How often are we asked to do that in real life?
There you go, absolutely. So it's the issue of authenticity. When in real life, when do someone say to you, okay, you've got 45 minutes, I want an essay, right?
Go to the DMV, write this paragraph.
Yeah, there you go. So some people say, well, it's not very authentic, and it doesn't happen in real world. And that's true, but there are some good reasons why a timed writing test is a good idea. And these are why, of course, it's included in large-scale writing tests, but also in the classroom. Why it's a good idea. So and maybe you use them. Why is it a good idea to have timed writing, a timed writing test as part of a writing class?
Fluency.
Sorry?
It helps them with fluency.
It helps them with fluency. What do you mean, Tani?
I think so, because well, and then of course, as the more they practice, right? But I think that giving them a time, it forces people to try to think faster and put their thoughts into words. And I think it may eventually help with their fluency.
I see. That's interesting. I agree that is right, and it helps develop their fluency. It's not one that she mentions, but I agree. Any other reasons? Do you give your students timed writing tests? Why do you do that? Why is it a good idea?
Well, if we're in the classroom face to face,
Yep.
the class period ends at a certain time. We have a 2-hour class period at my institution, so it has to be timed because we're all going to leave the classroom at the end of 2 hours.
Right, but Jennifer, why not? For example, why not tell the students, here's your topic, here's your topic. I want you to bring an essay back for me tomorrow. And so they're writing something, but it's not timed. What is the advantage? What is the advantage of getting them to do it in class and having it timed?
Maybe
Less
help
cheating.
them be more punctual.
I think Jennifer was saying about cheating. What do you mean, Hind, about being more punctual?
Being able to control their timing and do things.
Teaching them good time habits.
Yeah, time management, kind of.
That could be a reason. Here are the ones that she mentions, and I think these will resonate with you. That's this first one here. I mean, you want to see what students can do without help, right? You're not using your phone, your sister's not helping you, whatever, okay? And it's literally, I mean, if you're my students in the class and okay, here you have half an hour, here's your essay or paragraph topic, go. And it's like, you know, I can be sure that it's your work and your work only, and nobody else is doing that. So that's one of the reasons for having timed writing. Also, students do have high stakes tests, whether it's TOEFL or IELTS or ITEP or English 3 or whatever it is, and so they have to perform those kind of tasks. So it is actually good practice for them, and maybe connect it back to Tani's point about helping them develop fluency for those kind of tasks too. And she mentions one more. The test can measure their automatized language knowledge, and it gives a true picture of their proficiency and what they're able to do. And that's an interesting phrase, the automatized language knowledge. And it's that when you're proficient in a language, and maybe you're proficient in other languages, which I'm not, but the language is automatically right there. I guess in English, it's on the tip of your tongue. You're ready to produce it automatically because you're so proficient in it. It's just there and it's automatic. And of course, sometimes it isn't at all. Sometimes producing the language is a struggle. And you can see that sometimes in students' writing. Or sometimes reading. It's like a reading, assessing reading. Students will say, yeah, I didn't have enough time, you know? And I say, well, you didn't have enough time or you're a slow reader? Well, I didn't have enough time. It's like, you know, it's probably more likely that you're just slow reading. But that it's a good phrase, the automatized language knowledge, that you can produce stuff automatically. So that's why timed writing is good for doing that. Okay. I think one thing to just mention is that sometimes teachers get too carried away with this, and that the only types of writing they get students to do is in the classroom. And that's fine, but I mean, if you're teaching a higher level class, essay writing or research papers or something like that, you can't have everything done in the classroom. You have to go through a writing process, and they're submitting drafts and etc. So, you know, they have to be able to do some of the things outside the class, I think. Okay, I think that was the last of my 3 questions. So moving along, assessment literacy here. So one more task I want to do before we get into some discussion about writing and discussions about the article. Okay, here's part 2 of my quiz here. So, and it's the true or false part. So here's what you have to do. I'm going to give you some statements from the article, and the question is, how many are false? Which ones are false and why? Okay. We have one here about language proficiency. Two and 3 are about reliability here. number 4 is about writing prompts, and that's an important area. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that too. And I think one more. Research shows students prefer to be given a choice of writing prompts. So we have 5 statements. How many are false? Which ones and why?
I don't want to jump the gun, but I've got 2 trues, 2 falses, and a question mark, just saying.
No. The troublemaking student. There's always
Not given.
No,
Okay, not
sorry.
given. How about
Okay.
Not given.
So you're thinking, but okay, so how many are false? How many do you have pegged as false? 2. You got 2 as false. Which ones? Which numbers are false?
Me? Or I like someone else can go first.
No, but you tell me which ones are false, and then we'll see if others agree with you.
2 and 4.
Which ones are false? Which numbers?
2 and 4. 2 and 4.
Okay. Michael thinks that 2 and 4 are false, and he seems to be open to the idea that there might be one more that's false. What do you guys think?
I agree with 4 being false.
Uh-huh.
I agree also.
With 2 and 4?
4 is false.
For sure 4, and
4 for sure.
5 is false, I think.
I think 2 is false also.
They could be all false. I'm that kind of person. I would give you something like that.
I think you are that kind of person.
Gabriel. Holly, you're muted. How many are false, Holly?
I originally had actually 1, 2, and 4. I know people might fight me on 1, but
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I have
the one I
problems
gave a
with the word
question
but I have
highly.
questions about 1.
I have questions about 1 too.
Okay.
Holly.
Thank
All
you.
right.
I have,
I'll show you the answers, and we'll get into some of your questions. By the way, a reminder, this type of task, I used to do this with my students all the time, especially reading classes or whatever. And instead of getting them to say, okay, it's true or false, check your answers, and they just check their answers, it takes them 3 seconds, yeah, okay, and it's done. But if you ask them how many are true or how many are false, and they say, how many are true? And he says 2. How many are true? 4. Oh, talk to him and figure out who's wrong. And then you get a discussion going on. So I like doing this kind of task. How many are false? I forget. Let's see. Language, this one is fine. And she makes that point about proficiency and writing ability are highly interrelated, or at least there's some discussion about how much, but they're definitely related. Number 2, it's an issue of validity, okay?
validity.
And it's not reliability. And
Right.
the 2 things, just a reminder, 2 things you know about validity. Number 1, the primary thing we think about is the validity of the test itself. Is it measuring what it's supposed to measure, what we're trying to measure? But the second element is the decisions that we make based on the test and the test score. For example, it's a writing final and that student got a 76. He moves up to the next level, or he repeats the course, right? Those are validity issues. So it's the decision making that comes into play. Yes, one of the most, consistency in scoring is the key thing about reliability. Number 4, research shows that personal writing prompts are easier for students to respond to than the non-personal ones. And number 5 is fine. So, Michael, your confident response was right on the bat, and I'll give you a chance to ask some questions too. What's the issue with number 4? Why is it easier for students to write about personal prompts? What makes number 4 true? She doesn't talk about it, but as teachers, or if you're giving students prompts, why is it easier for students to write about personal prompts?
Because we
It's
know
something
our,
that they- Sorry.
Yeah. Hind, go ahead.
It's something that they already know. They're talking about themselves and their lives and personal
Yeah,
experiences.
and Jennifer, you're saying the same thing. Sure. I mean, it's something that they can bring to mind and write about it. Weigel makes the point, though, that she says that I think some of the research also shows that personal essays, they can be more challenging for raters and people scoring and rating the essays. sometimes they can be more challenging. But certainly students would like to write about personal topics. When I was teaching writing classes, whether it's essays and sometimes paragraphs, sometimes I would try to remember to include one of each. I would have a general topic or a personal topic, and they could kind of choose which one. Which links to number 5. I mean, students prefer a choice of writing prompts, and it's good practice, certainly, I think, for classroom assessment. Give students some choice, right? And at least they can, if they don't know about so you give them 2 prompts, they either don't know about the first one or they don't have anything to say about it, right? But maybe they can write about the second one, right? And sometimes you'll get students, and I've seen exams like this, students have 1 prompt and it's not a very good prompt, right? And then I've seen the grades later of how are the grades? Yeah, B's and C's, right? And I remember even a class that I taught, and somebody else gave a final exam, and there was 1 prompt, and I didn't really agree with it. It was something about the news or whatever, but it wasn't a very good, well-created prompt. And that's what my students got, B's and C's. I had A students, and definitely I had students that with the better prompt to write about, they would have been able to produce, better stuff. So, Michael, which one did you wonder about or had a question about? And by all means, we can.
Same one that Holly thought. Yeah. Number 1.
Number 1? Yeah. So it's, and I don't. So what is it that you were wondering about it? And it's not an area that I'm very familiar with. I guess the point is that if you language proficiency and writing ability, is she talking about first language proficiency or second language proficiency?
Yeah, I just wondered because often, you could be, I always go back to you could be very, so there's some people who aren't good writers or readers in their first language. And so, yeah, I think right. I was making that leap to, okay, I'm not sure I want to say highly as, obviously it's related, but, yeah. I don't know what the research shows either.
Yeah. Michael, what were you thinking about number 1?
So for me, I think this is one of the first points that she brought up, is that we can approach writing from the side of general writing skills that students may already possess in their own language, organizational skills, content,
yes.
These kinds of things. Or we can approach it from the sort of grammar and vocabulary side, where we're teaching and obviously then testing language. And this is actually an issue that's very personal to me, because in the program that I teach in now, we have almost 100% Chinese students, and they're in an advanced writing program, which is essentially a composition program, and it's not really a language program. And I see this as one of its weaknesses, is we're treating them as though they need to learn how to write academic compositions in terms of structure and organization, etc. But we're not dealing with the linguistic side of it, and I think this is a shortcoming. So yeah, that's why I kind of keyed in number 1.
No, those are good points to make, and there's a lot to be discussed about it. And I'm thinking about students Hind, I'm sure you know that. I mean, in English language programs in the United States, we got a lot of students that are in our program at the University of Arizona. A lot of Gulf Arabs coming in, a lot of from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and other places. And at least my experience, a lot of them very fluent spoken production. And I remember having fantastic conversations with guys from Saudi Arabia and other parts of the area. And they would be in my writing class, and you see their writing ability, and it's a huge difference. Their writing proficiency was much lower, and part of that is cultural, coming from an oral culture, but also just they didn't have much exposure maybe to writing English. But sometimes you see that the huge difference between very strong in one skill, but weaker in another one.
True. I have students, usually every term I have 1 out of 25 students can speak fluently, from TV. They learn how to, speak from movies and TVs and songs and stuff. When you get to the writing, it's exactly like the rest of the class, they struggle.
Yeah, so I mean, that kind of idea sometimes, I mean, it seems to contradict it a little bit, number 1, because if that is true, for example, if students are highly proficient in the spoken language, shouldn't they also be proficient in writing? You know, so anyway, we move on. Okay, part two, everybody. Same thing, true or false. How many statements are false? Which ones and why? What's going on here? Number 1 and 2 are about rubrics. Large-scale testing. And you have at least 2 trained raters. Number 4 is also about raters. Number 5 is about scoring and rubrics.
I think there's two of them are false.
2 of them are false. Okay.
I agree.
You agree?
Yep.
Patty, which ones do you think are false?
The first 2.
First 2?
Yep.
Okay. Jennifer, were you thinking the same thing, the first 2, or you're a different 2?
Oh dear. I thought number 2 and 6 were false.
But don't say oh dear. That could be right also. Okay.
Thank you.
Any more than 2 or less than 2? Is any other consensus? Michael is waving the 3 fingers there. He thinks more. There's more false.
I want to change and say that there are 3 because number 6, I agree, is probably false.
Aha. Okay. So we're going with 3. Anybody else?
I think 1 and 6 are
1 and
false.
6. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah. A holistic rubric. Usually when you have large numbers of test takers, and usually if you can give a single score, it's usually the preferred way of doing it. Number 2, also false. An analytic rubric. Yeah, I mean, and sometimes this is why sometimes teachers will prefer to use an analytic rubric, because it gives that feedback to students about, okay, here were the strong and weak areas of your piece of writing. And of course, sometimes analytic rubrics can take more time. Number 3, usually they have trained raters that are involved there with large scale testing. Number 4 is true. Number 5 also, sharing rubrics with students. And yeah, number 6, there's a general consensus among researchers and teachers, practitioners, that yeah, automated scoring should not replace human raters in writing assessment. And it doesn't, I don't think machines are at that level yet where they can do that. Yeah, okay. Number 4, just a reminder about that. I mean, raters and teachers also, we all have our own biases about assessment. We bring our own biases to assessment sometimes. And like I have this bias against, if for speaking assessment, like with role play assessments, I've never actually used any, but I guess I'm kind of biased against them because I think that they're producing scripted language. But people remind me also that, well, there's ways of doing it that can be better too. So just number 4 is a reminder that we all have our own biases, and of course what we do is that we try to minimize them and push them aside as much as possible. Number 5, just sharing the rubrics with students it's an important point, and just a reminder also, because the rubrics can be a teaching tool also, right? And as well as helping score assessments and stuff, it can also be a teaching tool. And I've given students rubrics and also sample essays and things, and we've scored them together in class, and that's been a pretty useful exercise.
I think rubrics are very useful especially when dealing with students with second language students, like my students who don't have problems with the language, and not only the test itself, but they're also struggling with the language. When they get the rubric and they know how they're being assessed, that really helps them. They always have questions. They always come and bring you the exam and say, why did I lose this point? But when you give them the rubrics, it helps a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent point to underline, Hin. Thank you. Okay, we'll just get into a discussion, everybody. And I just had a couple of questions. Maybe you have some also. So, in your own testing context, is there holistic or analytic scoring of writing more appropriate, or it depends? These are questions. This question is from Susan Weigel. She says, "What are the advantages and potential problems of automated writing assessment?" And the last one is about just what challenges do you face in your context about assessing writing, and how do you deal with them? So, and we can get out of screen share mode here and just discuss some issues that are related to assessing with writing. I have a question for Perry. Maybe Perry knows because he's coming from a large scale testing background. Perry, do you use any automatic scoring with the ITEP, or is it all you have human raters on hand there?
We use human graders for the writing and the speaking sections, and then we use automated grading for the other sections of the test.
Yeah.
Say that our graders, we do not allow them to see the grades that are made on the automatic grading sections of the test.
Right.
Afraid that might influence their grading of the writing and speaking sections. So
yeah. Perry, have you and your colleagues with ITAP, have you thought about and investigated switching to automated grading of writing? Because I guess it's one of the reasons why people replace human beings, is that if I can get a machine to do it, then I would. Is it, or do you think it might happen in the future?
I think it might happen in the future. We don't feel that AI is ready today to grade written responses or even speaking responses. Ideal, when I give instructions to my cell phone, it gets them right half the time. And
yeah.
So I think especially writing, where I understand a little bit about how AI grades. They grade strictly on grammar. They can't. It's hard to grade on idea development. There are a lot of things that are missed, I think, on AI grading. But I think someday it'll get there. And but in the meantime, and there's certainly problems with live graders. They have to be monitored. You can't turn them loose. They have to be checked periodically. So
I guess one of the arguments for computerized rating of writing is just that reliability and consistency. But
it is
whether they can do it as well is another issue.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Everybody and anybody, do you have any questions, or what kind of issues are you dealing with assessing writing or scoring writing? Any challenges or problems you're having?
I have a question for you, Eddie. And it's regarding non-native speakers that do evaluation. What's your sense of that?
Non-native speakers who do evaluations. If they're their language proficiency is superior and good enough, it shouldn't be any issues or any problems. We get teachers, coming from other backgrounds or other countries, and they're teaching in our classes. So I haven't seen it. Be a problem. Are you asking because have you seen?
I'm really interested in terms of the large scale testing, not in the classroom.
Oh, I see. So just
because I'm opposed to it myself, because I really find that there's a difference in how non-native speakers approach evaluation with their rubric. They're much more focused on the grammar, and as you said, some of the AI kinds of things, and they don't have the grasp of nuances of language, so they could understand whether a person has a greater depth of understanding. So I'm just curious what others are saying in the field.
I guess I would disagree with that on some points. That let me give you an example. We're scoring. We get together. We're scoring writing placements, right? So all the students come in and everybody's doing placement writing, and it's one of the times where you get teachers together and we have to score them. And I would do calibrations and training. But anyway, student produces this essay, and you have one student, one teacher. So you're giving this guy a 4 out of 5, and then the other teacher, he's giving them a 2. So you're giving them a 2. And I said, why? I mean, clearly they've produced a page worth of writing. There's a page worth of writing there. And so immediately you're getting a sense that, there's some proficiency there, but why did you give that a 2 or a 1 or whatever it was the lowest score? And he goes, it's memorized. I said, what? He said, that's all memorized. That student is from, and he said, China, that student is from country X. All that's memorized, right? Mm-hmm. That is entirely your perception of what is going on there, right? That's entirely his perception of what is happening there. And I told him, and I went through and scored it and gave that student a 4 out of 5. So I'm reminding people that, look, here's the rubric, here's the writing sample. Forget about these other things that you think is going on. Both of those are native speakers. Now that student, that teacher gave me 2, he was a Native American speaker. Okay. Right. And we have other people in there that weren't, and they did a better job. So sometimes people, again, we get into this thing of biases, but people bring themselves into scoring stuff. And they're sitting there, why did you give them a 3? Well, I don't know if he's good for this level, or I'm not sure about that class. And I'm like, can you please forget about all of that stuff that's influencing your decision making? Here's the rubric. Here's what they wrote. Just focus on that. And I think that can be done as well with whether you're a native speaker or non-native speaker, I think.
Do you think there's a difference between the training and the calibrations for large test evaluation, large numbers of testing evaluations, and what you do in a 100 student category?
Well, there might be more training involved with professional raters, but the principle remains the same, whether you're a classroom teacher or you're a rater working for ITEP, for example, and you have a good rubric that's in place, hopefully. But the question is, you got a good rubric, okay, that's only the tool. It's the application of the rubric. It's you're actually using it, and you're using it consistently to score the essays. That is the key thing. That it's how people are using it, and people are using it consistently or otherwise. But
how often do you check your raters if other people are reading things that are coming into and you're responsible for them? How often do you review or check on them? Do you every 5th test, every 10th test? How often?
I mean, when and Tani is assessment coordinator now at Cecil, but Patty, whenever there was placement coming around, so we would have 5 intakes a year, right? So every 5, Tani, 5? Yeah, I guess it was 5. So every 5 weeks. And that's when we would, before we would have all of these essays or writing samples coming in for placement, and we would get together and we'd spend a half an hour or an hour on calibration first, and then we would proceed. Tani, what do you think about this issue?
I was just thinking, because I've had research, not about writing, but about speaking, and how non-native speakers tend to pay attention to certain things than native speakers do, right? So I'm thinking here about speaking proficiency, and the fact that usually non-native speaker teachers will look more and pay more attention to their grammar or the accuracy of the language, as opposed to native speakers will pay more attention to the content, right? So I've read research about that. But I think, like Eddie was saying, if you have it's all biased, right? It's part of if you're non-native speaker or if you're native speaker, it's one of our bias that we come in when we're grading something, right? But I guess, like Eddie was saying, I agree. Like, if you have a good rubric and you're following that rubric, then I think it can be way more consistent when it comes to grading, writing, and speaking, no matter if you are a non-native speaker or a native speaker.
Well, can I ask you the same question I asked him then, of how often do you double check your raters then to see if they're being consistent? For example, he used the 4 and the 2. How frequently do you check that when you're doing test evaluation?
You mean for placement purposes?
Anytime,
yeah.
Any testing.
So I just started in this position. Eddie just left us.
Sorry.
Cecil.
I mean to put you on the spot.
But what I think is like Eddie said, we have 5 entry points within the year. And so we would have 2 teachers evaluating one specific writing. And then if there is a disagreement, like if there's a disagreement larger than X score, or average, then you would have somebody else, a third reviewer, to look at the. So whenever there are
the entry,
it depends on how many students we have.
Okay,
And
but we've
yeah.
had the highest we've had 400 students come in intake.
Okay.
We've had 400, and then you got 10 or 12 teachers sitting in a room for a couple of hours, and then but you have to do that calibration, and people are kind of on the same page with it. But even you do that, it's still, and Patty, maybe we've talked a little bit about it before too, or I might have mentioned. I mean, we're human beings, right? I mean,
right.
You cannot eliminate the subjectivity, right? But and I teach this when I'm doing teacher training. We try to maximize the objectivity and minimize the subjectivity, right? And that's what we try to do with our assessments. We can't eliminate the subjectivity because we're human beings, but you can really minimize it and say, look, here's the rubric, here's the writing sample that they've produced, the country they came from, and the levels in the program, and all of these other factors. Forget about all of it. Just here's what they've produced, here's the rubric, and score it that way. And that's kind of what I do when I do training. But and I guess when it's done right, the proof is in the pudding kind of thing, is that you just get greater reliability. And I've done this before. And for example, you've got 30 essays or whatever, 30 writing samples, and something like half of them need to go to a third rater. What does that mean? Well, your rater reliability isn't very good. Well, Eddie, your rater training wasn't very good either, or whatever. So, it can be hard to do, but it's essential. Yeah.
Eddie, just another dimension of that, because some people are good at this and some are not. I mean, they might be good English teachers, but they're not good graders. And so when you have 400 tests to grade and you've only got 12 teachers around, you will probably use all 12.
Yeah, and Perry, do you think it makes a difference that, for example, if you're paying someone to be a rater, which is what you and other large-scale testing companies do, if you're paying someone to do rating, do you think paid raters are maybe better at doing that than teachers, or not necessarily?
We have many people who apply for grading jobs. They go through our training program. They all don't pass, and these are trained English as a second language teachers. So you cannot assume that a good ESL teacher or a bad ESL teacher is going to be a good grader.
Yeah.
They're not trained to grade.
Yeah.
Or they don't have a knack for it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. I think a bigger issue and a bigger part of it is just the application of the rubric. And some people, you're just reminding people to really, the rubric is there and you need to apply it and apply it consistently. Michael, I think you had a comment or something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to address Patricia's point about native versus non-native raters in large-scale testing. So I'm an IELTS examiner, and I rate with mainly Americans, but we have one Greek and one Russian, and we're constantly monitored, and we get periodic retraining and calibration. And there is no difference in my situation between the native speakers and the Russian or Greek. I mean, so I think individual differences are probably much larger. I mean, when Eddie, you mentioned you gave something a 4 and someone else gave it a 2, that's not necessarily a factor of one being a non-native speaker. Those are just individual differences. And I think there's as much between 2 native speaker raters as there could be between, it's by chance that a native and non-native would give vastly different marks. Yeah. If the rubric is good and if the training is good.
Okay. How often are they, what's the checking system? I mean, obviously, if you've got, how many of you evaluate for IELTS? I'm assuming quite a few.
So how many raters in my center?
Yeah.
About 7 or 8.
Okay. So of the 7 or 8 that are there, how often or how many tests are graded by those individuals before they start checking to see if there is an inconsistency? I mean, I'm assuming that 2 people read the test. Is that correct?
No, it used to be, but now there's one, and there can be there's a system for rereading when there's a discrepancy between the writing and other scores.
Okay, so you don't do it on the basis of a discrepancy between 2 evaluators. You do it only when there's a discrepancy between their writing and their grammar, say.
Well, there's no grammar on the IELTS, but that's right. The writing and the reading. If there's a big discrepancy in those scores, it will automatically go to a second rater. But otherwise, there's periodic blind monitoring. So at any time, we could have some of our work monitored, and we don't. That can happen at any time. We don't know when. There's also every 2 years there's a recalibration. There's a training, a retraining followed by a calibration, and you have to. It's a test you have to pass, and if you don't pass that, you don't go on. And also, if at any time the blind monitoring, if you don't pass that, you have to do some retraining before you can mark again. And then also, students can challenge your scores, and so they can ask any student who doesn't feel that his score was correct can challenge and say that he wants that remarked. And if you're found to be wrong, then again you have to do retraining before you can mark again. So it's a pretty good system. And I worked both here, and I'm in Philadelphia, and I rate in Philadelphia, and also I was in Abu Dhabi, where there was just a slew of native and non-native speakers and raters, and there was never an issue of whether a person was a native speaker. I mean, there were other issues about competency, but it never really was about whether they're a native speaker or not. And I think to touch on Tani's point, also what's really important to consider is that while native speakers and non-native speakers may look at different issues, the use of an analytic rubric tends to flatten those out, because if I, as a native speaker, let's just say that I'm looking more at content, and Tani, as the non-native speaker, is looking more at grammar, but we all have to give 4. We each have to give 4 scores. If those, it doesn't matter if I give higher scores on content and Tani gives higher scores on grammar, because in the end, it's going to average out to 1 score. And as long as we're in the same band, it doesn't matter how we've evaluated it, because we've arrived at the same score.
And it also makes everybody pay attention to all these things, right? So when you have a rubric that calls out for, okay, you have to pay attention to these things. I am a non-native speaker. I'm also going to be looking at content, because that's also included in the rubric. So if you have a good rubric and a good tool that you're using, then you're going to be forced to pay attention to all these categories, right?
I think that, the general idea, and I think it's true, that any inconsistency in scoring, and I think whether it's a large-scale test or it's a bunch of teachers sitting in a room doing placements or final exams, that lack of reliability or inconsistency, I think it's primarily due to the application or non-application of the rubric. And some teachers some teachers are raters, they're just more focused and they're consistently applying the rubric, and other teachers are not, and that's part of the training. And I think, I guess if we were doing it together now, if we were doing a calibration session about using a rubric now, also how can I put it? The group imposes some discipline also. The group helps do the calibration, right? And if we're doing this and Holly is consistently given those killer scores to people, the low scores, and after a couple of rounds of those, Holly thinks that, okay, maybe I'm being too hard on people here. And she would kind of look at the rubric again and the different categories and adjust herself accordingly. But I don't think it's personal in the sense that just the application and the focus on the rubric use, rather than even rather than how experienced people are or where they come from or other things. I remember I did IELTS training also, and did IELTS interviews for a couple of years in Vancouver, and it was great because I learned so much about assessment. But I get this email and it's like, Eddie, and it says, I realized that when the interviews are recorded, and I realized that what they were recording, they weren't recording the test taker, they're recording me to see if I'm following and doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But anyway, the email was like, Eddie, your interview lasted for 94 seconds too long. We'd like you to come in for retraining. And I was like, holy shit. And I was deeply embarrassed, right? There was 3 or 4 other people in where I'm working with, and we all went in, and it's like, great, I got to go in and do retraining. And, you know, it was a huge blow to my ego, and et cetera, et cetera. So I go in for retraining, and I had to sign in. Everybody I was working with had already been there for their training already. So, you know, so that kind of thing happens when you're involved in group kind of assessments. So, you know, I don't know. Hopefully if we didn't answer your question, Patty, we give you some other things to consider. Maybe.
I appreciate the fact that Michael said that it's the analytic, because I think analytic does get to it more carefully and not the holistic. And that's my concern a lot of times if you're doing large groups of testing, that it's just done holistically and not analytically. So thank you, Michael. I think that's good ammunition to have for discussion.
Yeah. And Patty, it goes back to that key principle. So you got validity and reliability, but sometimes practicality trumps everything, especially when you got large numbers involved. And that's why the holistic rubric comes into play, and I think sometimes it's true. If you've got a good holistic rubric in place, it can, you know, and it just saves time, and you can do more work also. So, okay, anything else? Anybody you wanted to bring up? Hin, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to make a comment about what you said earlier about somebody who thought that the student memorized the exam, and it's important to follow the rubric, because this is something that happened to us during last term. We kept Cambridge exams, and our students some of them are A0 learners, so of course they're going to memorize the speaking exam. Like, they know the questions, we train them, but of course they're going to memorize. So one of the teachers was, you know, taking points off for memorization, and then she had to do the whole thing all over again. So yeah, it's important for, you know, teacher training at the beginning of, you know, before they start marking their exams, to know that they have to just not focus on what they think, but focus on the rubric. And
yes. So you've seen that in action in your class. Yeah. Very interesting. Okay. Any other issues or questions going on with assessing writing? Anybody? It's can be quite challenging and time consuming. I guess it's one of the things, as you know. I mean, sometimes assessment has a bad reputation attached to it from students as well as teachers. And teachers, you get this image of, maybe you have this experience of sitting at your kitchen table at 1 o'clock in the morning, going, why the hell did I give them this essay to write at this time? Or why was I asking for drafts? So, I mean, writing can, and sometimes you hear teachers groan, say, oh my God, I got to teach a writing class, you know, so it takes time and effort, I think. Yeah.
I had a question.
Sure.
I'm not necessarily having any issues now, but I'm teaching, you know, my class is all online. The rest of the ESL program I'm with is sort of mixed, partly online and partly not. They're trying. Any issues with that you're finding with online assessment writing?
I'm going to defer to my colleague Tani, Tani's more online teaching recently. Tani, please.
I've had a lot more issues with cheating as well, with writing, right? And so trying to curb that, it's definitely a challenge.
Tani, do you change your tasks, or you change anything to try to minimize any of that cheating or plagiarism stuff?
One thing that I've tried to do is not to copy topics that I could find online. I try to come up with the topics myself, because then it's from my head. It's not something that they can type in and find sample answers.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. It took longer, because I had to come up with something from like very original so that they wouldn't be able to find that online.
Yeah. I mean, I remember being amazed once we were doing placement writing, and we had this, you know, we had a couple of hundred students come in, and this one student, we were sitting around grading, and the teacher's like, no way, this is plagiarized or memorized or something. And we took a look at the writing sample, and it was a personal experience, something personal, and it was a fishing story. The person was out fishing, and then something happened, whatever, and the fishing got disturbed. There was other things going on, and then when he got back to the fishing, there was a fish at the end of the hook, and that was the end of the story. And it was this beautiful thing. And it was like, no way. And teacher went to the computer, Googled the first 2 lines, bang, there it was, the whole thing. But we were amazed, like, how does it's just, and I guess some people will do that. Sometimes, okay, I'm going to memorize 5 or 6 of them, or I'm going to memorize some paragraphs, and you know, I'll fit it in wherever I can, whether it's on an ITEP test or maybe it's on in a writing program and stuff. So those things happen sometimes too. All right, everybody, great. It's a very interesting discussion with everybody, and one of the reasons why I like doing this is that, I mean, it's a learning experience for me also, and I learn from my colleagues and friends that are all over the place. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks again to our sponsors, English 3 and ITEP, for sponsoring us. And coming up next month, we're going to be talking some more about rubrics. So I hope you'll come back and join us next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. That was
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.